and welcome back to Book and Page. We are about to get into our next book, Beowulf, but I think we ought to talk about the style a little bit, which would be epic poetry. Half sounds exciting, half sounds like the stuff that you had to do in high school English class that you didn't want to do, doesn't it? But epic poetry itself is a really interesting category in such a way that it is terribly, terribly broad. And we try to define the category, and oftentimes we fail at defining that category. So what this video is going to do is tell you how we try and define that category, and then also admit when it fails to do that. So, there are two key parts to the title, epic poetry. Let's start with the one most people are going to be probably a little more familiar with, which is poetry. Now, the poetry of an epic poetry sometimes isn't even poetry. Yes, I am serious about that. Sometimes epic poems can actually be presented in prose. And this is especially true when they're modernized. A lot of people find prose easier to read because we've now got the concept of a novel which is fully in prose. But the poetry choice was understandable when you consider where epic poetry actually started from. You see, we had it as poetry because this was meant to be performed. Yes. This was meant to be performed. And even larger ones, consider both the Iliad and the Odyssey, are considered epic poems. See, epic poetry as a genre style dates back to usually before different communities had writing styles. So they were put together as oral traditions, and they were meant to be performed. Poetry, a little easier to perform, a little easier to memorize than straight prose, and you'll notice there's often conventions around that poetry that help that memorization. In fact, one of the key things that epic poetry shows is a use of epitaphs and similar used phrases. Homer is big on this. His wine dark sea or the rosy fingers of dawn come up a lot. And that's because they're stock phrases that the poet who is narrating can use, especially if he's struggling and needs a second to remember exactly where he is. That is also to say that the versions of the poems that have carried down through the writing systems might not exactly be what were written down before, and places where oral traditions spread far and wide and changed due to local communities, we actually have multiple versions of these poems. This is less true with things like Homer and Beowulf because we get just a singular text coming through, more true of places where this mythology is still living in oral tradition. A lot of African countries will have different versions of these poems depending on the storyteller telling them. It's something you've got to get used to. And in fact, some of these poems really can change. We know for a fact that a lot of times if you get a massive genealogy mentioned, that genealogy could get switched around depending on the audience you're performing for. If you've got a king who is descended from a certain line of the Greeks, you're going to want to play up that line's presence at the Trojan War in the Iliad, aren't you? It's going to win you some renown, not only knowing the history, but also praising that person's ancestors. It's considered smart that way. So while we do have some stock poetry styles, there is no one singular style, because epic poetry is actually a world-spanning style. I've mentioned Africa. I've mentioned the Greeks. Beowulf's written in Old English. We have got Irish epics, Scottish epics, Indian epics. So ultimately, you're not going to get just one style of poetry. Dante's Divine Comedy is written in a very different style of poetry than Paradise Lost. And yes, both of those are considered epic poetry. So you'll notice that already one of our first criteria, that they were written before, well, writing was a thing, has already gone up in smoke. That's because this is a style that's carried down through the ages. So while a lot of epic poetry does come from this time, for the most part it's actually referencing back to that time. And that's where we get the epic section coming in. You see, epics focus on a time before our history, sometimes before even memory. And it tells the story of what happened before that point. And usually it will focus on the human side, so we'll get a human figure dealing with gods, monsters, and other supernatural events. But this, again, can be shaky. For example, Paradise Lost, until we got Adam and Eve coming in, focuses a lot on Satan. And we wouldn't exactly define him as either human or hero. So we've always got to keep in mind that when trying to talk about epics, we're seeing a very fluid format. It's going to move a lot on us. And same is true with everything we try and place around it to box that in. Focuses on a human hero in a time before memory. Though a lot of times you will see history that we're aware actually happened brought in. For example, we know that there was something called the Trojan War. Do we assume it happened exactly as Homer tells it in the Iliad and the aftermath of the Odyssey? No. No, we're certainly not assuming that Apollo showed up, ripped the breastplate off of somebody, and allowed them to be killed. But that's kind of the point. We have these historic events, or sometimes historic people coming in, that we're building this myth around. Well, let's go to one of the big ones. How about Arthur? Well, Arthur's an interesting one for whether or not we actually get any epic poetry, because there's a form close to this that suits a lot of Arthurian works a lot better. It is Epilean. Which generally is smaller epic poems that focus more on the mythological and romantic side of things. So the romance. Ovid is a big example of this, but it's more likely where most people are going to see the Arthurian literature sitting in. But again, you can see exactly how fluid these definitions are. Because was Arthur a historic figure? Well, there might have been a historic figure, probably a Roman general, but as King of the Britons, And that's sort of what we need to accept coming through here, along with the poetry styles changing based on where these poems are originating from. So too is the history of the world. We're going to get different gods, different heroes, and different monsters coming in, all defining that world section that they need to deal with. Indian mythology is going to have very different ideas than something like Beowulf, which is Old English. Trying to see and discuss those differences, we're going to have to be a little careful. Well, why don't we try and define epic poetry a little more, or at least give us an idea of what we can be on the lookout for as we're going through. Now, at least one of these I have already mentioned, and that is the use of stock terms repeatedly showing up. So, Rosy-Fingered Dawn, Cow-Eyed Athena, that's a big one. Apparently it's supposed to be nice. But there are a couple of other traits that we can generally lend to epic poetry. So we usually start with a proposition. This is the opening theme or cause of the epic. Some examples. Homer is a big one that I'll keep referring to simply because a lot of people have read the Iliad and the Odyssey. He starts the Iliad by asking to know of Achilles, sing of Achilles' rage. It's a question that he wants answered. Why is Achilles raging? And then the rest of the poem is there to give us the answer to that question. In Milton, he states that he's writing this poetry in attempting to justify the ways of God to man, because we're stupid and God is smart, and we need help understanding. Does this show up immediately in everything? Well, not at the very beginning. In the first section, certainly we're finding out what the problem is, but the initial problem of Beowulf is not the problem of the entire epic. The initial problem is one particular monster, who we're actually going to handle very quickly. So, again, this is going to appear and disappear through our definitions. How about number 2? An invocation, usually of a muse. Well, if you're in a Western country that knows the Greek muses. Yeah. Nope. Indian epics? Probably not. African epics? Probably not. But maybe we're seeing an invocation of some other type. For example, we actually start Beowulf off with a lineage, a history lineage of this family. So maybe it's an invocation both to kingship and this kingship line. Maybe we can stretch the definitions a little bit. Welcome to English literature. Isn't it fun? And by English literature, I mean I'm reading in English, but this is not just English. This is global literature. I'm good at this. Okay, so we've got the proposition. We've got the invocation. Oftentimes we're going to start in medias res. For those of you who don't know what this term means, it's actually the nice way of saying we start in the middle. Yep, we're going to start in the middle of the action. Homer again. The Iliad starts after 10 years of the Trojan War have already happened. Why? Well, part of it is you are hopping right into the action. The other part is that this was an oral tradition of a history you're already assumed to know. For us, in medias res can actually be problematic because we don't always know what's happened up to this point. The Iliad doesn't make a lot of sense unless you already know the history of the Golden Apples and Helen being in Troy. So there is information that we need to fill in for ourselves before we can understand things. It's just assumed that the listening audience when these poems were originally composed is already going to have that history. So in medias res, we just skip to the good parts. And finally, enumeratus. That is to say, catalogs and genealogies abound. Beowulf, like I said, certainly fits this. We actually start with a genealogy. Homer is the master of this. Book 2 of his entire Iliad is a catalog of ships. Basically, we go through every kingdom, every major general, and every ship he's brought, to name all the important people. It's fun and exciting. But like I mentioned before, there are some reasons for doing it this way. You really like showing off how well you know the history, and you really like showing off to the people that you're performing to. So if you know they had family members, ancestors, that fought in the Trojan War, yeah, you make sure to include them in the list. Listing off enemies, also very important. And if you want a hint for how to deal with these lists, pay attention to the first person mentioned and the last person mentioned. Those are going to be some pretty big hitters. Also, if they've come up repeatedly in the story, I suppose pay attention to them too. So, understand epics yet? No? Great. That's kind of normal, to the point that we've also used epic for other genres. Epic fantasy is probably a big one most people recognize. Whew. Yeah, that's the hard part with epic poetry. It doesn't quite fit anywhere. It's constantly changing, a lot like the poetry itself. Sometimes you've just got to roll with the punches. The definitions aren't going to be super easy, but sometimes it's actually better not to stick things in a box. Let them be free. Throw Aristotle out the window for once in your life. And say, you know what? I don't need a definition to know. Beowulf's going to beat some bad guys up, and I'm going to have a fun time reading about it. So why don't we go ahead and start reading? I certainly am. And I'll see you next time.